We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, with my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon.
Thank you, Garland.
The U.S. will hold their first trade talks with Taiwan as U.S.-China tensions grow. Also, the U.S. steps up military construction in the Pacific region, seemingly in preparation for war with China. Joining us to discuss this and more, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start with this. Last Friday, a U.S. Navy Poseidon P-8A intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft flew through the Taiwan Strait. This seemingly routine event was anything but. Indeed, it appears to have been the latest U.S. gambit in its dispute with China over the legal regime governing such passages, and thus their conflicting views of the relevant international order. Dr. Horne, your thoughts?
Well, obviously, this is highly provocative and quite dangerous, but not surprising. You know that as we speak, the so-called Group of Seven, the leading capitalist nations led by the United States, including the Western European states plus Japan, are meeting in the Bavarian Alps, and high on the agenda is not only Ukraine, but how to confront China. In that regard, a special guest is the Prime Minister of India, speaking of Prime Minister Modi, because India's relations with China, or shall we say complex and complicated, despite their mutual membership in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And we know that India is also part of the so-called Quad, that is to say India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. There are so many, there's a proliferation of these U.S. front organizations right now. Another one has the phrase Blue Pacific in it, which I won't bore your listeners by talking about. But it's a reflection of this growing hysteria about the People's Republic of China, the possibility, if not probability, that it is in the passing lane and will leave the imperialist nations sprawling in the dust. To that extent, you should also look at the current issue of Foreign Affairs, published by the Council on Foreign Relations on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a State Department front, if you like. And Ivo Dolder, who is a longtime U.S. diplomat, has a piece where he suggests that the Group of Seven needs to be expanded. Interestingly enough, in his call for backup, fundamentally to confront the People's Republic of China, because I guess he feels that the Group of Seven does not have enough muscle and metal to confront Beijing, he suggests that the new members should include Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, the European Union, beyond France and Germany, and of course NATO. And keep in mind that when NATO meets in a few days, high on the agenda in that Spain meeting will also be the People's Republic of China. Now, some of your listeners may be scratching their heads and say, wait a minute, I thought it was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization focused on Russia, focused previously on the Soviet Union. Well, I think listeners need to get up to speed. That this confrontation with Russia that we are enduring today is really only chapter one. Chapter two involves going after the big burrito, the big enchilada, speaking of the People's Republic of China. However, the North Atlantic countries also know that they have a real dilemma because Taiwan, the rebel province off the southern coast of China, only 65 miles from Japanese islands in the Japanese archipelago, a nation of 23 million, also happens to contain a Taiwan Semiconductor, which has a de facto monopoly control of computer chips, believe it or not. And that's why you have this scurrying in Congress to try to build computer chip facilities in the United States. Because since China has continued to insist that Taiwan is part of the People's Republic of China, if somehow there's an accommodation between Taiwan and Beijing, Taiwan would have then in its powerful economy the major chip manufacturer on planet Earth, which would then be even more muscle for the People's Republic of China, which is one of the reasons why Washington has to keep up this drumbeat of hysteria about Taiwan, to keep Taiwanese off balance, to prevent any sort of accommodation by Taiwan with Beijing, and also to keep and continually confront the People's Republic of China itself.
So when I look at this Taiwan Strait and the United States, the Poseidon P-8A surveillance aircraft flying through the strait, the United States says that this is an international waterway. China says, no, it's our sovereign territory. The United States says you're wrong, but the United States is not a signatory to the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. So the United States doesn't even really have any legal basis upon which to make its argument. But the United States continues to engage in this incredibly provocative behavior. And I'm trying to figure out what's the win for the United States if, for example, and heaven forbid, China shot the plane down. I mean, this is to me analogous to playing chicken on the freeway, and it works out fine till you get run over by a truck.
Well, I think from the point of view of the hawks in Washington, as they survey the landscape, they feel that they have a military advantage over Beijing. That's their perception. Even though, as we've said on these airwaves more than once, in 19 tabletop exercises involving confrontations between the Chinese and U.S. military, the Chinese prevail 19 times.
Can I interrupt and give an analogy? The United States is the drunk in the bar fight. I have yet, and I've been in a few bars, to see a drunk win a bar fight.
And I don't think that the pattern will change anytime soon. But keep in mind as well that if you flip the script, you'll be able to understand the folly of U.S. positions. Suppose if Chinese aircraft were buzzing Honolulu, buzzing Los Angeles, buzzing, heaven forfend, Washington, D.C., you can only imagine the outrage that would ensue in this particular country. But once again, the mantra of the United States is that consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. However, Washington may come to rue the day it adopted that slogan, and it may have that slogan, I'm afraid to say, planted or imprinted on its epitaph.
We also see that the U.S. government is doing some building up some more air bases on some islands in the Pacific. Apparently, they're now concerned that the island of Guam, that their air base there could be destroyed by Chinese missiles. Obviously, they are preparing for what would be an economically suicidal, if not worse, but at minimum, economic suicide by going to war with China at a time, I might add, where there's an economic suicidal suite of sanctions going on with Russia over Ukraine. Our economy is collapsing, and they seem to be ignoring the current problems, looking to maybe go out in the world and drum up some new ones.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Pacific. If you look at the New York Times website as we speak, you'll find an interesting op-ed by the journalist from the Solomon Islands known as Dorothy Wickham. And she's trying to explain to the typically naive U.S. readers as to why the Solomon Islands has decided to have closer relations with Beijing. She mentions, of course, that the Peace Corps, which is actually a pittance when it comes to foreign assistance, has pulled out of the Solomon Islands, that Australia, only a population of less than 30 million, New Zealand, less than 6 million, don't have the wherewithal that the People's Republic of China does. And of course, the People's Republic of China has this Belt and Road Initiative that is pouring $1 trillion or more into places like the Solomon Islands. You might have seen the reaction at the G7 meeting in the Bavarian Alps where they've come up with a kitty of 600 billion, which barely competes with Beijing's massive amount that it is spending. But once again, it shows the competitive pressure that the North Atlantic countries are under. But having said that, I think that this confrontation with China will introduce rifts into the North Atlantic alliance. It's no secret that the German economy, which has been heavily dependent upon Russian energy, is even more dependent upon Chinese markets. We also know that with the recent elections in France and the surge into influence of left-wing parties, that there will be increasing pressure upon France to settle this Ukraine conflagration. And keep in mind that it was France under Charles de Gaulle, their post-World War II leader, which years before Washington decided to recognize reality and recognize the People's Republic of China, France had recognized the People's Republic of China. And keep in mind as well that Jacques Chirac, Mr. Macron's predecessor, had traveled to China dozens of times before he was pushed out of office. And so do not be surprised if France begins to peel away from the United States with regard to this confrontation, not only with Russia, but with China. And that actually portends, I'm afraid to say, given the illogic in Washington, even more adventurism, even more belligerence on the part of the hawks in Washington, believe it or not.
And Dorothy Wickham, in her piece, she really makes it very simple. She says the Solomon Islands is small and remote, but and that basically the West has ignored them. And she says, you've got to show up. If you really want to have influence, you have to show up. And the United States has not showed up. And that China is showing up. I mean, that math is pretty simple to do. We got about a minute left.
Well, of course, if the Solomon Islands wanted to absorb some of the military materiel from the Pentagon, then Washington and the Solomon Islands could do business. But what, of course, they're looking for is hospitals, schools. They're looking for a stadium, which China is in the process of building. And they're looking for scholarships for their youth. They're looking for job training for their youth and skills such as carpentry and electricians. The United States can hardly provide that for its own population. So how are they going to provide it for this nation thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away, not only from San Francisco, but from Honolulu?
But we can send $70 billion to the Ukraine, though.
Well, of course, in outmoded military materiel that probably will be destroyed on the ground by Russian bombers before it gets into the hands of the Ukrainian military.
Well, I can say this. If they need some extra bio-research labs, we can sure help them out there. You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, researcher. You can, wherever books are found online, go there and you can find lots of stuff from Dr. Horne. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, with my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon.